So from that perspective of revelation, you would expect that the Quran has overlap with, or one might say is almost identical to, revelations brought to other people. Now we have to make a qualification here. Overall speaking, it is very much true that the Quran does indeed contain many stories and many references that Jews and Christians would know from the Bible. Now, on occasion, there is differences in emphasis on a particular story, or differences as far as oftentimes minor details are concerned, and in a couple of cases also differences that would be considered by some religious traditions as being major differences. And so the question then arises, how come? How is it possible that the same God could send these messages to different prophets, and that these messages end up being different in the final analysis? And the answer, the theological answer to the problem, as given by Muslim tradition, is that the Quran was received in its most perfect form, and the Quran was not just received but also transmitted in a more perfect form than the scriptures of the earlier traditions. So in other words, what we're talking about is the Quran is suggesting that either in terms of the way that people interpret the scriptures of Moses and Jesus, or that the actual text of these scriptures on occasion has received mistakes.
Would you provide some notable characteristics of Muhammad?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Muhammad is a very interesting figure in that he is providing a role model for Muslims at large. And when you look at the way in which Muslim traditional literature portrays Muhammad, there are a number of characteristics that stick out. As we said earlier, as far as the pre-Islamic times are concerned, this is the Muhammad before his revelation at age 40. There are a number of assertions being made about Muhammad. He is perceived by the community at large as rather trustworthy, and this before he gets called to prophethood. So it's not a function of him being a prophet that makes him trustworthy, but rather it's the other way around, that in Muhammad we have a person who is identified by all Meccans, as far as we can tell, as a trustworthy person. Muhammad is also a person that carries charisma. That is to say, he is a person that has the ability to convince just by his word many people, his early followers. I would also point out that as far as characteristics of Muhammad are concerned, particularly when you look at the history of the early revelation and the reaction that Muhammad gets from the powerful of Medina, that here you have a person who is not giving in to pressure, who, once convinced of the truth of Islam, is willing to undergo suffering. And when you look at that history of persecution, you have to admit that there is a long period during which Muhammad's own life was in grave danger, a time during which he and his family were discriminated against. We are talking about some of the measures of persecution that included a boycott against the entire tribe to which Muhammad, or the entire clan to which Muhammad belonged. And during all of this difficult time, Muhammad does continue preaching the message. Also in that context, it is important to notice that Muhammad does not stoop to the level of violence, but rather that he is patiently and very consistently carrying on with the message without, while he is being attacked during this time in Mecca, he is not hitting back, he is not using violence against his own opponents.
What was the role of the person of Muhammad in the reception and understanding of the Quran, the revelation of God.
Right. What we have to say is, of course, the center of the religious tradition of Islam is clearly the Quran. The Quran is understood to be verbatim, word for word, directly from God. The Quran is understood to be the ipsissima verba, the very words of God as they were revealed to Muhammad. So that is clearly the center. But now when you look at the Quran, you're going to see a vast number of verses that talk about Muslim theological concepts, that make reference to prophets from before, that talk about a people who have received prophets and how they fared vis-a-vis the prophet, the overall theme being, if a people follow their prophet, the true prophet from God, they will fare successfully. If they reject the prophet, their doom will follow. But that's only part of the story. Now, within the Quran, you also have verses that tell a Muslim how to live one's daily life. But as far as that aspect of the Quran is concerned, you have a few references to a particular aspect of Muslim behavior, but you do not have a comprehensive guide for a Muslim as to how to live one's life. And this is where the example of Muhammad comes in. The Quran itself has a number of verses that suggest that the Muslim is supposed to be following the Quran and God's messenger, that is to say, Muhammad. So here, Muhammad's role as some scholars call it, divinely guided exemplar, become important. It is Muhammad's paradigmatic example in his life, in the things that he did, in the way that he related to humans, to his neighbors, in the way that he related to others, in the way that he undertook daily rituals, in the way that he undertook familiar matters of family, in the way that he treated guests, he treated children, he treated women. In all of these aspects, Muhammad now becomes, for Muslims, the exemplar whose paradigmatic examples each individual Muslim should follow.
In what ways did Muhammad transform the social environment?
That's a very good question. The way that the story is related, the term that the Arabic sources use for this time before Islam is Jahiliyyah, the time of ignorance. And there are beautiful stories in the early texts that we have that describe how the message of Muhammad, the message of God that Muhammad brings to the Arabian community, change this pre-Islamic time of uncivility and of barbarity to a time of lawfulness, to a time of following God and God's law, a time of order, a time of protection for the individual. There's this one quote in one of the very earliest biographies of Muhammad, it's the Sirah of Ibn Ishaq, that makes this point very succinctly, and I might just quote a little bit from
You're welcome to.
that scripture. Thank you. The context that we have in this particular text is a scene where the Muslims who had been persecuted by the Meccans, some of the Muslims escaped this persecution by finding refuge in Abyssinia, what is nowadays Ethiopia. You just more or less hop across the Red Sea on the African continent. And this country at that point in time was ruled by a Christian king. And so we have this Muslim community, and the spokesperson of this Muslim community, Ja'far ibn Abu Talib, who is actually related to Muhammad, and he gives this speech in front of the Christian king, and he is explaining what Muhammad and his message are all about to this Christian king. And he says the following in this source: "O king, we were an uncivilized people. We were worshipping idols, we were eating corpses, we were committing abominations, we were breaking natural ties, we were treating our guests badly, and our strong devoured our weak.